The Judge Rotenberg Educational Center, the ever-controversial facility that boasts a near 100% acceptance rate for the most difficult of students, is now back in the news after a recent court ruling in their favor. I took a deep dive into the 50-year history of the Judge Rotenberg Center as well as their founder and their infamous electroshock device. The JRC spends a lot of time and money to lobby the government in their favor and to silence their opponents. So what exactly are they trying to cover up? So for years now, I've had a recurring fear of sorts, like a false memory of an old insane asylum, like the kind from a horror movie, perhaps set in like the early 1900s, where you might get a lobotomy for having a mental illness like feminism, or that you might be prescribed opium for a cough. But right now, this fear of torture that was depicted in those movies has once again become a glaring reality for the autistic and disabled communities and communities of color as well. The problem is, they've been under our noses the entire time. Just some context before we dive into this ongoing nightmarish story. I personally have been recently diagnosed with autism, and I have a first cousin who is as well. So as the saying goes, this hits close to home. So whether you have autism yourself, or you know somebody who does, or you just consider yourself to be an ally to the community, I encourage you to spread the word on this issue. At the end of this video and in the description box, I will have more information about how you can get involved. I'll also have links to my sources and to documents and records that you can read, including first-hand accounts from survivors. So after you watch this video, I highly encourage you to listen to actual survivors. One of them, her name is Jennifer Msumba, and she actually has a YouTube channel. So I want to let her tell her own story, so I won't be talking too much about her. So let's go ahead and dive in. First, we'll talk about why this is relevant right now. Content warning, this video will contain discussion of medical violence, ableism, torture, self-harm, death, and a brief mention of sexual assault. Viewer discretion is advised. On July 6, 2021, a federal appeals court for the DC Circuit overturned an FDA ban on a particular electric shock device used at the Judge Rotenberg Center in Canton, Massachusetts. This device is called a graduated electronic decelerator. Oh, don't worry, I'll explain all about it in just a moment. The FDA had previously enacted a ban on this device in March 2020. Unfortunately, this ban never actually took effect because of the pandemic. From what I understand, they were not supposed to put anyone new on the device, but they were not required to discontinue anyone from using it just because of COVID precautions. So the ban was overturned after JRC made an appeal on the grounds that, quote, the FDA lacks the statutory authority to ban a medical device for a particular use, end quote. So they cannot address other arguments or the substantial evidence presented against the device. Both the device and the JRC were condemned for torture by the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture in 2010. And they were condemned by several organizations such as the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, Disability Rights International, the Community Alliance for the Ethical Treatment of Youth, as well as many autism, disability rights, and human rights advocates. So how did we get here? So this requires a little bit of background knowledge on the history of electroshock therapy, applied behavior analysis, and just how all this comes back around to the JRC. I just want to be clear, right now I am not condoning any of these practices or trying to minimize the suffering of those affected by the cruel, inhumane treatment that they received from the JRC. So I'm trying to give an unbiased look into the history and why this started, but it is very difficult for me to remove bias against torturing children, so I'm sure you understand. I do want to also clarify right now, JRC is home not only to children but also to adults. So I kind of use student or resident interchangeably here, but they just know that they house people from, I believe their youngest students are in 3rd grade, and they have people, I believe, like in their 40s as well. So like quite a wide range. So recently I found an interview that was originally published in 1974 thanks to a fellow autistic talker, that's a person with autism on TikTok. This is what sparked my deep dive into the JRC and its history and launched me into a now 5-day hyper-focus marathon. I'll link the full interview below, just echoing my earlier content warning. It's from the 70s, so it's quite offensive. So lots of outdated language and words that are now slurs. So this interview was with Ivar Lovaas. The late clinical psychologist is credited with early behavior modification therapies, or the beginnings of ABA, or adaptive behavior analysis, for autistic children and also developed the practice of conversion therapy. Great. So his therapies used aversive tactics like electric shocks, slaps, and verbal reprimands. That was supposed to be in addition to, like positive reinforcement. The end goal of his treatments was to take an autistic child and make them quote-unquote indistinguishable from their non-autistic peers. The studies lasted from the 60s all the way up into the 90s, and it is worth noting that his studies are unable to be proven or replicated due to ethical concerns. So here's a brief summary of the interview. The interviewer asks him to describe the characteristics of an autistic child. So basically he says that as they are disturbed, do not enjoy being held, don't play with other children, they don't respond to noise or verbal commands, don't have speech, or they just repeat what other people say. And this sums up the attitude of that time period. He says that parents of the children he worked with were very nice people, so it was hard to believe they would produce an autistic child. So that's why there was such a big rush in psychology to sort of figure out how to fix it. One of the key takeaways of the interview was that his therapies were designed to stop autistic behaviors, which are things like sensory meltdowns, self-stimulation, which we now refer to as stimming, and also self-destructive behaviors. And that can be really confusing or frustrating for someone with autism. You don't know how to ask, you don't know how to get help for it. You just are different and you have different feelings from other people don't understand. So that's why like self-destructive behaviors and things like that are not uncommon. But in most cases, they can be redirected to some degree. So anyways, my tangent was that things that autistic people do are not inherently wrong. They're only wrong to society because they're different. And society hates anything that's different. So anyways, moving on, Mr. Lovaas. So he explains how he used spanking, full body restraints, verbal reprimands, and electric shock to get his subjects to stop unwanted behaviors. Then later in the 90s, he admits that aversives were only temporarily effective and became less effective over time. Imagine that. Which, by the way, did I explain what aversives were? Okay, so aversives are basically like what I just said, like spanking, restraints, verbal reprimands, shock, that kind of stuff. And there are more that the JRC uses that I'll mention in a minute. So all of that, like boiled down, the name for all of that would be Applied Behavior Analysis, or ABA. So an ABA is still very much in use today, and it's meant to change a person's behavior to be more socially acceptable. And it's also not just for those with autism, it's also for brain injury rehabilitation, dementia, substance abuse, phobias, etc. ABA is in and of itself very controversial due to the emphasis on assimilation instead of acceptance and the history of aversives. So with that background, your mini psychology lesson out of the way, let's move on to the JRC. So the Judge Rotenberg Center was founded as the Behavior Research Institute by a behavioral psychologist named Matthew Israel. So side note, he is still alive and he has a PhD, but none of the articles or interviews that I found refer to him as doctor. So I'm just going to refer to him from here on out by his last name, Israel. I could not find out why he was not referred to as doctor despite having a PhD, so do with this as you will. So just a little bit of background for this next section. It's not like terribly important, but if you've studied psychology at all, even just intro level, like in high school or something, you've probably heard of B.F. Skinner. He developed the methods of like operant and classical conditioning, basically the systems of reward and punishment that would help modify someone's behavior. And most of his studies were done on rats, but he was very influential in psychology, so there's no denying that. And Ivar Lovaas was actually inspired by B.F. Skinner. But when Matthew Israel was in college, he read a novel, fictitious novel, written by B.F. Skinner called Walden 2. But in this novel, the characters built a utopia by conditioning the residents of a commune through the behaviorist principles of reward and punishment. So Israel says this was like a quote-unquote religious conversion for him, and then he later went on to graduate school and studied under B.F. Skinner. And this is where my research took a turn. So Israel went on from there to attend a Walden 2 conference. There was a conference for the novel, and he started an organization for others that were also interested in trying to create one of these utopian behaviorist communities. So in 1967, he tried for the first time to build a utopia. So he built a small communal house and met a woman with a 3-year-old daughter who allowed him to perform experiments on her, the daughter. So he says the little girl has a screaming problem, and he kept trying to modify her behavior to get her to stop screaming, and it wasn't working. So one day he says he snaps her across the cheek and she stops. But eventually he reports that he only had to just shake his head and she would stop screaming. So he tried a second time in a different house, and I couldn't find what happened there. But he explains to an interviewer that he didn't get very far with his first 2 attempts because the subjects were just able to leave or, move out. So he started a school. In 1971, he started with 2 patients, teenagers with schizophrenia and autism, in a day school in Rhode Island. This was the beginnings of the Behavior Research Institute, which would later go on to become the Judge Rotenberg Center after a few different iterations and moves of the BRI. So in 1977, he founded a sister branch of the BRI in California and applied for a license to operate a group home. And this was actually ideal because he could control most of the environment, much like the setting of Skinner's novel, Walden 2. But his application was denied by the California Department of Health due to the lack of meaningful peer review, unnecessary use of painful aversives, insufficient evidence that he was responsible enough to comply with regulations, and the fact that he was unlawfully practicing psychology without a license. So without a license, the school got shut down and they all lived happily ever after the end. Unfortunately, that's not the case. A group of parents of the kids that he was treating helped him to rebrand as a co-op and then reapplied for a license. So thanks to ex-governor of California, Pat Brown, they not only received the license, but also the only permit ever granted by the state of California to use physical aversives. So in 1979, a former staff member filed child abuse charges against the institute. After an investigation by the California Department of Social Services, their abuses were noted as improper and unsafe use of restraints, humiliating punishments, failure to provide proper nutrition, failure to provide proper medical care, several injuries from aversive interventions, and the destruction or altering of records. This is a common theme. It was also noted that the school threatened to expel children if their parents spoke out or questioned the institute. So after this, their license to use aversives was revoked, and Matthew Israel was forbidden from setting foot on the property in 1982. However, on July 17, 1981, these practices ultimately led to the school's first student death. Danny Aswad was just 14 years old and passed away while restrained face down on his bed. At that time, the institute was not authorized to use restraints on students, and Danny had previously had a rod surgically implanted into his back because of a degenerative back disease that was caused by his treatment there. Subsequently, the school relocated to Massachusetts, where corporal punishment was illegal, but of course they were granted permission to use physical aversives in 1983. So I guess Massachusetts didn't ask for references from California. Oh, the good old days before the internet. The institute was welcomed to Massachusetts with open arms, thanks to its near-zero rejection rate and willingness to take the most difficult of students. Matthew Israel said, and I quote, "No matter how big, how old, how disgusting the student, we won't say no." End quote. Unfortunately, or rather unsurprisingly, more deaths occurred at the institute in the 80s and 90s. I'm trying to rein myself in, retain my humanness. And this next one, I can't. Vincent Militic was a 22-year-old autistic man with a history of epileptic seizures. So he was making quote-unquote inappropriate sounds and was restrained and forced to wear a white noise-emitting sensory deprivation helmet. Those were common practice at the BRI for autistic people who struggle with understimulation as it is. So tragically, in 1985, he died of asphyxiation after suffering an epileptic seizure while wearing the helmet. The judge found 2 staff doctors guilty for approving the therapy, and Israel was found negligent in authorizing the helmet's use. Abigail Gibson was a 29-year-old woman with a seizure disorder. She was subject to regular physical aversives at the BRI, and she suffered a heart attack in her room. She died 2 days later at Surrey Memorial Hospital in 1987. Linda Cornelison was 19 years old and was nonverbal and intellectually disabled. In 1990, she was placed on a contingent food program where food was withheld as a punishment for undesired behavior. She suffered a gastric perforation, which basically means her stomach was torn, and her expressions of pain, because she was nonverbal, were interpreted by staff as misbehavior. So the staff administered 56 physical aversives over the course of 5 hours before calling an ambulance. She was unconscious when the ambulance arrived and died on the operating table. After an investigation of Linda Cornelison's death, her treatment was found to be, quote, inhumane beyond all reason, and it violated universal standards of human decency, end quote. But the judge did not find JRC responsible for her death. And I'm just going to let you sit with this one. Linda had been a resident for 7 years, and her records showed that she was subject to 88,719 aversives. So just to, I don't need to justify this or reason it any. It's like the judge said, it's inhumane beyond all reason. But to put that in perspective, that's at least 30 punishments per day for 7 years. So from the age of 12 to 19, your formative years. The most recent one, I found quite a few corroborations of this story. I didn't find any from the other ones because they were a little bit older, but people who were previously residents or previously had worked at the school did mention this young man. Silverio Gonzalez was a disabled 16-year-old who lived at the facility for 11 months. In 1998, he made an attempt to escape a transport bus and died from head trauma after the fall. Just a little bit more background. From what I gathered, the majority of people who lived at the facility lived like off-site in houses, but not with their families, with staff. So the students would be bused into like the main facility from like their houses. So in 1994, the name of the BRI was changed to the Judge Rotenberg Educational Center in honor of the judge who helped save the program from extinction. They moved to the current facility in Canton, Massachusetts in 1996. So with all that, let's go back to the GED. So the graduated electronic decelerator was modeled after the SIBIS, I'm not 100% sure how to say that, the self-injurious behavior inhibiting system. I'm going to call it SIBIS, okay? In 1984, the SIBIS was designed to sense when a patient was about to perform self-injurious behavior, such as hitting their head. This was designed by somebody else, not them. It would then automatically deliver an uncomfortable, that's important, uncomfortable electric shock, which was 85 volts at 3.5 milliamps for less than 1 second. Remember that. The SIBIS was used at JRC on 29 students between 1988 and 1990. One such student was Brandon Sanchez, a 12-year-old autistic boy. Brandon is actually the nephew of former Massachusetts State Representative Jeffrey Sanchez, who repeatedly saved the JRC from attempts to ban aversives. So Brandon had several self-injurious behaviors that caused him to rapidly lose weight. I'm not going to say what they are because but basically he couldn't eat anything, and these were very, very violent behaviors that were towards himself, not anybody else. But like he really needed help and like positive intervention. But the Israel and the staff started the shock treatments on him with the SIBIS. So 50 shocks became 100, then 500, then 1,000, and he wasn't responding. Or they weren't working, basically. So after 5,000 shocks in one day, they stopped. And Israel thought they just weren't strong enough. So he asked the developers of SIBIS to increase the voltage, but they refused. Good for them. So he made his own. The first iteration of the GED was more powerful and lasted 10 times as long as the Cybus. And in 1994, the FDA cleared the device for the treatment of self-injurious behavior since it was similar to the Cybus. But Israel quickly saw that students were adapting to the GED-1, so he produced stronger versions, the GED-3 and 4, which were not cleared by the FDA. I kind of wonder what was the 2? What happened with the 2? Like, was it a horrible failure? Or was it too strong? So just a brief science lesson if you don't know much about electricity and how it works. Voltage is what gives the electricity its power, but amperage gives electricity its strength or intensity. So that's a more accurate measure of something than the voltage. Which again, I don't know why I'm trying to explain this because it's wrong either way, but just trying to be thorough. So remember, Cybus, 3.5 milliamps. The GED-1 produced a shock of 30 milliamps for 2 seconds, while the GED-4, which is, some students now use the 1, some are cleared for the 4 if they didn't respond to the 1. The GED-4 produces a shock of 90 milliamps for 2 seconds. Its lowest setting is about twice the typical pain threshold for an adult human. A police taser is around 2.5 to 4 milliamps. A cattle prod is about 10 milliamps for only a fraction of a second. And currents of 50 milliamps, only 50, not 90 like they're doing, can cause cardiac arrest. So the school used to actually let reporters test out the GED-1 to see just how painless or almost like a bee sting it was, but they do not let anybody touch the GED-4. So the GED was never thoroughly tested in peer-reviewed scientific literature, and only 2 studies have been done. The first study concluded that repeated shocks to the same area were more painful and thus more effective. The second was co-authored by Israel and concluded that there are no side effects to the GED. Science. I'd also like to note the difference between the GED and another treatment called electroconvulsive therapy, or ECT. So ECT is done under general anesthesia because it is painful, but it's done under anesthesia. And the point of it is to induce seizures to treat certain mental health conditions. So this is similar concept, but vastly different application from the GED, or shock aversion of any kind, because it's done as a punishment and is very painful. ECT is meant to cure long-term things, not behavioral things. So what's the big deal with the GED, aside from obvious clues that it's painful and torturous? So the JRC is very insistent that the GED is a life-saving device that allows their worst students to go on to live a happy, productive life, and they only use it as a last resort for self-injurious or violent behavior when other positive behavioral support has failed. That's what they say. Former students, parents of former students, staff, and several investigations by various organizations and experts in psychology beg to differ. So here is a list of things that the JRC does or has shocked its students for. This is not all-inclusive, by the way. Failing to be neat, wrapping their foot around the leg of a chair, stopping work for more than 10 seconds, closing their eyes for more than 5 seconds, minor acts of noncompliance, using the bathroom without permission, urinating on themselves after being refused a bathroom break, screaming while being shocked, tensing up while being shocked, attempting to remove the device, refusing to remove a jacket, reacting in fear to another student being shocked, whispering, humming, putting fingers in their ears, waving their hands, talking to themselves, using an inappropriate tone of voice, etc. Do any of those sound like self-injurious or violent to you? No? Okay. So not only are the students trying to learn and do their schoolwork in fear of being shocked, they also sleep in fear of being shocked as well. Students assigned to the GED must wear the device at all times, even while sleeping and showering. Now back to our science lesson. I'm sure you're aware that water conducts electricity. So can you imagine being strapped to an electric shock device while you're trying to shower? I found at least one instance of that going wrong. And that amount of power on wet skin would literally kill someone. The device is worn as either a backpack or a waist bag containing 5 2-pound battery-operated devices, each connected to an electrode that would attach to the skin. The staff carry plastic boxes clipped onto their belt that contain a remote with a picture of the corresponding student, so they don't shock the wrong one. Reports from former students state that the devices would regularly be set off accidentally, and the remotes could be mixed up and shock the wrong student. And they said sometimes the frequencies would cross and the remote would activate the wrong one, or the electrodes would be placed incorrectly by the staff. It was also reported that staff would purposefully shock students out of view of cameras or antagonize them into misbehaving so they could shock them. Again, this is all of this stuff is on the internet. It's out there. I'm not making this up. And former staff, who were few and far between thanks to non-disclosure agreements, have reported being threatened with termination for not shocking students enough. So the staff did not have the liberty to make judgment calls. So if a student performed one of the listed misbehaviors, then they were required to shock them. And everything was under 24/7 surveillance. So an incident that has come up again recently was in 2002. An autistic teenager named Andre McCollins was restrained on that 4-point board and shocked 31 times over the course of 7 hours. His offense was not taking his coat off when he was asked to do so. So the subsequent shocks were given as punishments for screaming and tensing up while being shocked. Surveillance footage of this incident was released in 2012 as part of a lawsuit filed by his mother, who stated that there is no counseling for the residents and the staff lied to her all those years. And this video is still on YouTube right now. So this is a really good analogy. I thought I would include this. One former employee described the treatment to a Mother Jones reporter like this, and I quote, "Say you had a hospital that was the only hospital in the nation that had chemotherapy, and they were treating people who had the common cold with it. I think the extreme to which they abuse their power has outweighed the good they do." End quote. So as if the shocking itself wasn't enough, some students would be restrained and shocked at the same time. So one student describes a restraining board right in the middle of the classroom. So these have been described like kind of a wooden door that's just out in the middle of the floor, and they would be restrained by the wrists and ankles on the board, like you can imagine. So too many behavior strikes and you'd be shackled to the board by your wrists and ankles and shocked while trying not to scream or tense up, because then you'd get shocked even more. And all in front of your classmates who were also trying not to react, because then they'd get shocked too. The JRC also uses restraint and seclusion in their abusive tactics. Several students and parents of former students have reported being shackled and secluded anywhere from months to 2 years. So this was done to prevent the student from ripping the GED pack off or when the device was deemed to be ineffective. And students who were deemed to be dangerous were restrained in the prone or face down position. And this alone is very, very dangerous, to be restrained face down, and it's banned in many states. And yet another way that the residents are abused is through behavior rehearsal lessons. Bet you never heard of that one before. So what is a behavior rehearsal lesson? Well, in one of these lessons, a student is provoked or tricked into exhibiting a target behavior by staff, such as eating a non-food item or maybe destroying property, something like that. And if they refuse to do that behavior, they are punished for non-compliance. But if they do it, they're punished more severely for breaking the rules. So either way, the student is punished. Though it is noted that few students are reported to be subjected to these specific kinds of lessons. The list goes on. Another punishment for undesirable behavior, like I mentioned before, is a contingent food program. Students in this program must earn their food and are forced to discard portions of their food they did not earn. If they do not earn their daily minimum calorie intake, they are given a makeup food which has been altered to be noxious or unappetizing. Okay, now that's over. We should talk about the hoax phone call, which really kind of, you would think, signified a shift, but no. So in 2007, the center received a phone call alleging that 2 students had misbehaved earlier that evening. The students were awoken from their beds and given electric shocks. One received 77 and the other received 29, and one of them had to be treated for burns because the electrodes were not moved enough, so they were shocked too many times in the same place and got burned. So the call was later determined to be a hoax by a former resident who pretended to be a supervisor. So this incident launched the JRC into 2 investigations, one by the federal government and one by the state of Massachusetts. During the investigation, Israel ordered videotapes to be destroyed despite a court order to keep them. In May 2011, Israel was indicted on charges of child endangerment, acting as an accessory after the fact, and obstruction of justice. He was forced to resign his position in a plea deal. So you might have been thinking, how do they get consent for this kind of treatment? So the JRC must go to court for each student that they think needs these level 3 aversives, basically the GED. So for months leading up to the hearings, it was reported that students would be provoked into misbehaving so that they would have more evidence of the need for shocking this student. One student describes her experience in this court hearing. So she was brought into the courtroom in a helmet and restraints and was not questioned by the judge. Didn't talk to her at all. So prior to her hearing, she reports that she was denied showers for 2 months and placed on the restraint board and washed in front of male staff. It was recorded as a major behavioral issue when she expressed her concern for their inappropriate touching. And the requests for consent from the court were rarely denied. So with all of this in mind, does the GED actually work? The short answer is no. The objective of the JRC appears to be forcing students into obedience and conformity with more restrictions than a non-disabled adult or child would have. The lasting effects of this device far outweigh the benefits, of which there are none. Shock aversives have dozens of long-term effects, including but not limited to worsened emotional and behavioral disorders, muscle stiffness, impotence, damage to teeth, scarring of skin, hair loss, PTSD, severe depression, chronic anxiety, memory loss, sleep disturbance, feelings of fear, loss of control, loss of dignity, humiliation, powerlessness, abandonment, despair, confusion, loneliness, and night terrors. So a 2006 investigation by the New York State Education Department found that the JRC uses these level 3 aversives on students without a clear history of self-injurious behaviors and who are not aggressive or destructive. So while the GED is successful at scaring and traumatizing students into submission, it's not sustainable. So the students for whom these techniques quote-unquote work will never be able to leave the facility because even the JRC admits that they will regress in their treatment without the device. Why? Because it doesn't actually work. There is no evidence that the JRC uses positive reinforcement or even counseling and therapy sessions to address the root cause of their students' troubled behavior. In my days and days worth of research, countless articles and investigation reports, I did not find one singular instance of counseling or any type of emotional support therapy being provided. And this is despite their claims that the GED is only used as a last resort. It's their only resort. It was also noted in that 2006 report that students' reported amount of inappropriate behaviors increased after admission to the JRC in order to substantiate the need for the use of aversives, and that clinicians' notes only document inappropriate behaviors and not positive behaviors or academic progress. And there was no evidence that the JRC considers the negative effects that may result from the use of aversives. Other findings from this report concluded that not only were students not given adequate instruction because they just sat in front of computers all day, but instruction was used as a negative reinforcement tactic, which in turn caused more behavioral problems. And on several occasions, students' IEPs, or individual education plans, included speech and occupational therapy, but were denied by the JRC. Students were not given social skills instruction or taught anger management, which further prevented students from being able to transition to less restrictive programs. So like I mentioned at the beginning, this is also a racial issue. So the demographics of the JRC. Most of their students are from New York and are around 90% Black or Hispanic. So they will send promotional materials to various institutions and have picked up inmates from juvenile detention centers and from Rikers Island. And some residents are even sent from the foster care system. So you see now how it's all coming together. It costs $275,000 per year to keep a resident at the JRC, which is all tax funded. And in 2019, their annual revenue was over $78 million. I looked at their tax returns. Almost all of that was from this like admission or the tuition that the government pays. They don't receive that many donations. They also regularly lobby the government to prevent the passage of legislation that could threaten the school, which lobbying is not, like it's pretty common with nonprofits, but lobbying the government to be able to continue torturing children. And the government allows it. So in 2010, I thought this was interesting. It was reported that the school cut a check for $100,000 to none other than Rudy Giuliani's law firm to lobby against a bill that would ban the use of physical aversives. And there is also a discussion of yet another relocation in case of a legislation change in Massachusetts. So the implications of all this. So the JRC is very successful at manipulating parents and families of students into thinking that their treatment is the only way and the best option. There were reports that students were provoked into self-destructive or unruly behavior, so the center could film a before and after video to show to reporters and prospective parents. Then for the after portion, they were heavily rewarded and not given aversives for several days so they could sit still and smile for the second half of the video. Do you want to know who fought the hardest for the FDA to lift the ban on the GED? Parents of the residents. That's right, their own parents. So the JRC wants you to believe that they are doing nothing wrong and they're saving the lives of their students. So with all of the evidence presented here in my research, their damning amount of lawsuits, the non-disclosure agreements they have with former staff, and just how much they bend over backwards in their own self-preservation, are they hiding something perhaps worse than the GED? Is the JRC a state-funded torture chamber for disabled minorities? Why are they so insistent upon their students, both children and adults, staying well past their school years? And if they were truly able to help the worst of the worst cases, wouldn't it be beneficial to do the appropriate therapies and then transition them back home to another facility instead of delaying their progress so they can help more people? Wouldn't that make sense? So if the JRC has in fact improved since the departure of Matthew Israel, why are there no current reports on the inside happenings of the school? From around 2007 onwards, there's nothing. I get the pandemic and not allowing visitors right now, but what happened from 2007 to 2019? Were we supposed to just forget? So during my research for this video, I came across dozens of stories of autistic children and adults being unjustly punished for behaviors that are not only normal to human beings, such as being afraid or wanting to stand up, but also traits of autism. The fight for autism acceptance has been ongoing for years and is being set back by these programs and by the ABA. And autistic people are naturally either hypo or hypersensitive, so under or oversensitive to certain stimuli, so we may want to cover our ears or shut our eyes if it's too loud or too bright. And we also self-soothe in different ways to allistic or non-autistic people, like rocking back and forth, for example. It's not dangerous and it helps us manage our feelings and emotions, but it's so foreign to non-autistic people. Ableism and the concept of othering is so deeply ingrained into our society. And we hold on to these dangerous beliefs that disabled people are somehow subhuman or can't experience feelings the way an able person does. And more often than not, a disabled person's worth is measured by how much of a burden they are to their families and society. Families will often put their own needs and comfort before those of their child, and institutions like JRC prey on their fears and discomfort. Disabled people are worthy of love, respect, dignity, and compassion. There are better alternatives to this torturous shock therapy. So if you want to help, here's how you can get involved. All this information is current as of, I'm filming this July 13th, 2021, so things may have changed since then. If you're watching this way far in the future, these may not be applicable, but still spread the word and let people know that this situation is unfortunately not unique to the Judge Rotenberg Center. And it may be happening in other places as well, but they're just better at hiding it, I suppose. So there is a petition to shut the Judge Rotenberg Center, and I'll have a link to that in the description as well. The last I checked it was about 10,000 signatures. But most urgently right now, how you can help. If you're in the United States, there is a bill currently sitting in Congress as of today. It's called the Keep All Students Safe Act, or KASSA, K-A-S-S-A. And this bill, if it gets passed, would ban almost all kinds of restraint and all kinds of seclusion in schools receiving federal funds, i.e. the JRC, and others as well. So if you're in the US, please call or write to your congresspeople and ask for their support of KASSA, House Resolution 3474. I'll have links to more information about KASSA and how to contact your representatives. There are templates that you can copy and paste, but it is much more effective if you write something in your own words. Just a few days ago, I wrote a message to my congressman on his website, and I put it in my own words and described how I felt and why I felt that KASSA was necessary. And his office actually called me and said they were reviewing the bill. So your messages do help. There is also a list of organizations you can contact to request a public statement condemning the use of the GED. So the full list of those and the suggested script is on AwTeach's website. I'll link that below. And if you are in Massachusetts specifically, if somehow this video reaches you and you're one of the few people in Massachusetts, please call on your representatives to pass Massachusetts House Bill 225. So this bill would ban any procedure that causes obvious pain to the recipient, including but not limited to hitting, pinching, or electroshock for the purposes of changing someone's behavior, and any other behavior that would be legally prohibited to do to a non-disabled person. But if you are not in the US, just spread the word on social media. If you have friends in the US, let them know. International pressure may help. I'm just not sure how to go about that. So if you know, leave a comment and let us know. I know this is extremely troubling, especially if you or someone you know has autism. But if you're able to, I would highly encourage you to listen to stories of survivors like Jennifer Msumba. I'm going to link to her testimonies and everything below, and she has her own YouTube channel. So thank you for listening and watching all the way to the end. And join me in speaking for those who weren't able to speak for themselves, and to honor those who have suffered needlessly at the hands of this organization. As of posting this video, my YouTube channel is not currently monetized. So if you were shown ads on this video, I did not make any money from them. If I do later receive the ability to monetize my channel, then ad revenue from this video will be donated to the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network. This is not my usual content. I post autistic relatable stuff on TikTok at Cruelty Free Stitchery, which is actually my business TikTok, but I kind of transformed it into stuff about ADHD and autism, so if you're interested in that, follow me there. If you want to learn more about autism in general, I would highly recommend AwTeach, AUTEACH.com. They also have a TikTok, and they have a podcast there where they help you learn about autism and neurodivergency in general. You know, if you want to subscribe and stick around, you're welcome to do so. I would love to have you. So that's all for me today. I will see you in the comments. Please be nice there and respectful. See you later. Goodbye.